Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we respond to and discuss a subject that you've requested, questions about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the Vision for Life podcast. The basis for everything we discuss on this podcast is God's revelation of himself to us. God's revelation surrounds us. His revelation of himself brings wisdom and clarity to those who lack the ability to see. It provides us with a unique spiritual light, which allows us to see things we couldn't previously, unaided by God's word and by God's Spirit. In Ephesians, the Apostle Paul describes this in this way: I do not cease to give thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and of revelation of him, having the eyes of your hearts enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which he has called you. He wrote those words to the church in Ephesus, and they've been preserved for us as the church today also. Today, I'm joined by Katie. Katie, hello.
Hello.
Katie is joining me to talk about politics. We currently are in a 4-part class on politics, and we're taking time in these podcast episodes to develop and discuss some ideas and themes that have come up in our class, to take some questions. And then also we have asked members of Fellowship Denver who work in politics and have a specific vantage point on the political process to join us. And that's why we have asked Katie to join us today. So we're just going to jump in. And Katie, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your political story, how you were shaped and formed politically?
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Creedon, and I, have a lot of experience in social work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But my upbringing was in Nebraska. I'm actually Mennonite background and grew up with parents who were farmers or raised by farmers. And I think a lot of our ethic as a family and like what really made up our experience and what we put time in and money and value as a family into was community service and civic engagement. We're all pacifists. It's kind of something that really transitioned with my growing up in Nebraska, kind of having like a small business farmer mentality. So I was raised to vote very conservatively, but community minded, I would say, is a really good way to describe like the first 18 years of my life. And then when I left school and left home to go to school and then grad school out here in Colorado, I think a lot of my experience and kind of my current work and views have been shaped by meeting people and engaging the community along the way and really seeing and hearing how people live that is so different from the way that I was raised.
You have a lot of experience in various aspects of community work as an adult once you finished grad school. So what have those years of your life, the last 15 or so years after you graduated from grad school, looked like as far as your work?
So I came out to Colorado to study international human rights at DU, and I came from, my very first job was as a forensic interviewer and a child advocate. So I think immediately I really saw, obviously, a group of people, so kids and families who really needed intervention services. And as an advocate, you start to see trends or things that kids are facing. And I really wanted to do something more like, hands-on or take a more active role. So I decided human rights and social work was the direction I wanted to go. And I think that my first few jobs here in Denver, I worked at Asian Pacific Development Center and I ran a women's health program. And that was kind of a really good and kind of an unexpected window into how a lot of immigrants and refugees live in the Denver and Aurora area and lack of access to healthcare and how that impacts a family. So, and specifically women and children, but also, the systems they live in and the communities and the churches and all of those different things. So that led me to other kinds of work as a community educator and all sorts of different work with different populations. And today I work at the Colorado Children's Campaign. I run their statewide network. So I'm a community engagement and child advocate in that capacity.
Does the Colorado Children's Campaign have a mission statement or a way that they explain the nature of their existence? What's the purpose of that organization?
So our tagline, or kind of our slogan, is every chance for every child. And we are a statewide organization. So we're focused on statewide and kind of community policy efforts at the Colorado state level. So what I do is I run a network of advocates that encompasses, I would say, almost every county in Colorado. And the goal is really to hear from each community about how kids and families are doing, and then use policy to address some of those issues or ways that we can, I guess every chance for every child means exactly what it says. Like, how can we improve the lives of kids? How can we impact families? As kids live inside families, how can we impact families and kids for the better?
Hunter has explained politics in the class as this broad category that encompasses various kinds of activity. So he has explained public square politics as the way that we organize our common life, things like schools and businesses and HOAs, governmental politics as the way that we organize and conduct government, and that often impacts public square politics, what happens at that governmental level. Sometimes those regulations have this effect in our public square politics. Then electoral politics is a third category that is the way we choose people who serve in government. And lastly, persuasive politics as the informal system of debating and arguing about public policy. And that can happen in so many spheres of life, in media, in events, in volunteer groups, in talking with our family. And so in the past few weeks, we've discussed that many of us engage in persuasive politics. And then we also get to participate in electoral politics. We have the opportunity as Americans to participate in politics in that way. But for many of us, this aspect of governmental politics is not something that we actually work in or have an inside kind of viewpoint on. But your organization, the Colorado Children's Campaign, does do policy work. So can you explain that aspect of your work?
Yes. So we are a policy advocacy organization. So we advocate for specific policy, and we are also a research-based and data-driven organization. And all of those words together really just mean that when we are creating policy or advocating for specific policy, we really need to look at all these different elements. So we use research and data, and also, history, like trends and things that have continued, previous solutions to all sorts of things that affect families. We also really pay attention and listen to the community and what kids need, what families need. And for me, as a network manager, I really pay attention to things that come up every year, like the lack of affordable housing across the state, like as an issue that families and kids continue to be facing. So when we are deciding what we advocate for every year at the state legislature, we take into account stories, because I believe stories are data as well. So anecdotal information, as well as research and what the research is saying about what best addresses these things for kids. And then we try to craft or advocate for policy that really meets those needs.
And you have mentioned to me before that the Colorado Children's Campaign is a nonprofit organization.
That's right. Yeah, we are nonpartisan. And the reason for that is obviously a couple of things. One, we have funding from private individuals. We have all sorts of different kind of funding that would keep us, I think, the most effective organization. We would need to be nonpartisan. So our goal is not to advocate for one specific candidate, but really what serves the interests of kids and families. So it's really important that the policy that we work on, the most effective policy, is bipartisan. And by that, I mean policy that we advocate for, and that a bill that passes the state legislature, which usually runs January through May, although this past year with COVID, a lot of things were thrown off, and I'm still kind of waiting to see what will happen in 2021. Traditionally, bipartisan policy is not, changed every 2 years when things turn over or could turn over in the state legislature. So, and again, I am not actually a policy expert. I work with a lot of amazing, intelligent, creative individuals who I have learned a ton about the inner workings. Like, I come at this from the social work perspective and the community engagement perspective. And what I have been able to learn are some of these skills as far as using policy as a tool. And yes, the Children's Campaign's goal is really to increase the quality of life for kids and families. And how can we do that equitably and in a way that will last?
Mm-hmm. So you're a part of what ends up being the legislative process.
Exactly.
For a bill to move through Congress.
Yes.
But your specific portion of that is really on the very front end in the community engagement, in listening to stories, and then collecting enough data to put together a proposal that could turn into a bill and then move through the legislature.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways that policy creation can occur. And like I said, I am not and will never be a good candidate for a job as at a think tank. That's never going to be me. But what I love so much about working in policy is addressing some of these issues at the systemic level. So being a social worker, I did a lot of case management and a lot of situations every day, like responding to needs in the immediate, which is such an important role. And for those of you who are involved in that, bless you. And I think that is really important work. And I may go back to it at some point, but I think when you start to see trends and patterns and how kids are living and what families need and what is not happening for so many specific groups in our community and society, you want to make a change at a larger level. So the Children's Campaign's goal is to really, it's so many different factors that go into this, but good policy is all of these things. And as an advocate, my role is at the beginning to get this evidence or stories or data. We often hear people who want us to get involved or take a position on legislation they are bringing forward. So sometimes that's specific legislators. Other times it's groups or other organizations like ours in healthcare or education areas we work. And we have to decide, is this something we weigh in on? Is this something we don't? And another thing I think that really we emphasize is just throughout the process, training up other people to be advocates. So explaining the process to people who are not at the table and trying to bring them in is one of the things I do. So parents, people who speak different languages, people of color, people who often aren't a part of traditional policy creation and wanting to make sure their voices are heard.
And that's what you do through your community networks,
Yes.
is invite those people in, those voices and perspectives in. And so it sounds like, based on your description, those community networks are pretty diverse and probably intentionally so, somewhat because based on the issues and themselves, the people that are affected by those issues, and then some because of the people that you actually ask to attend.
It's really important. And if I'm doing my job well, I'm looking around and saying who is not at the table, who is not represented. And not because representation automatically means that your view is chosen. And I think that's a really important part of, I think, being a Christian in this space, and also just having humility for what is best for the group, or what is best for the people who are furthest away or the most marginalized. So I think if policy is done well, which is something that we are kind of new to, honestly, I think I myself have had to learn a lot about what it really means to hear from people different than me and in different places and grew up with different experiences. And it's been a really important part of creating good networks where you actually get feedback from the people most impacted. I think if we look at traditional politics, they are still the majority is white, usually male, and usually people who have had some sort of privilege, financially or other, to have the kind of support to get you to those offices. And that often doesn't include parents and people in lower income groups and people of color, people who are newer to this country for a variety of reasons. And we make policies that impact all those people. So I think if it's done well, we do either at the Children's Campaign or I would say the network I run, and these are words that, it's sort of like buzzwords sometimes, but I think grass tops and grassroots are words that are kind of thrown around, but partnering with organizations that are grassroots. So like the actual parents we're talking about, that is when policy is really, really effective, when we really hear from all of those people.
And you're using that word grassroots, even though you said it can be a buzzword, but you're using that to differentiate the nature of the work that invites in community perspective from, for instance, something that you mentioned before, a type of policy that could be introduced via a special interest group or a specifically funded group. So grassroots policy that is initiated that way starts like this, with people sitting around a table talking, and someone who is the advocate, in this case you, listening, and then you continue to collect data that either supports what you're hearing or doesn't, and you use that to help make the decision about what to advance.
That was an impressive summary from all of my talking. Yes. I think that, and again, I'm still learning, and I always want to say, like, I am somewhat of an expert in some things, but if I only look from my own perspective, I'm not going to really, there's going to be things I miss. And one of the communities, for example, that I have really been, felt convicted that I have not really addressed in my, formative years is the community with disabilities. So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about creating equitable policy is, an example of that is ADA laws. So when we look at buildings and sidewalks and even things like putting in curbs for people who might need wheelchair access or other sorts of accessibility, ramps, those sorts of things. When you put an elevator in a building, everyone uses it, but it was put there for folks who needed, who couldn't use stairs for whatever reason, or stairs were not like a good option for them. And we all use them. So we all benefit from when you create these policies that address needs that others might have. The accessibility, or I think just bringing people in, and the idea of inclusion is really a part of being the body of Christ, but is not always present in politics. And I don't think I need to explain why that is.
That's an interesting way to present those ideas. It's true that I, for instance, in a really simplistic way, but I like the way that you provided a concrete example of that. I, as a mom of 3 kids, have pushed kids for years in strollers and have used many a ramp that wasn't actually put there for me as a mom with a stroller. And yet I directly benefited from it. And so that is an illustration of how something like this, noticing a need, addressing it, can actually really benefit more people, a much broader group of people than the group that it was initially directed towards. We've talked some now about your work, the nature of your work, but we also asked you to come today because you are a part of Fellowship, and you have been for a long time.
So true.
We were just talking about that actually before we started recording the podcast episode. Katie was one of the very few people who are still around at Fellowship who came the first Sunday that Fellowship had its actual beginnings.
Even I can't believe it. I was telling Autumn this is like my longest running adult relationship, basically, aside from people I was raised with. But yes, I was, like I mentioned, I came out to Colorado to go to grad school at DU, and I was basically dragged to the first Fellowship Sunday service in September in 2006, I believe, by my one and only other faith Christian friend in the city of Denver at the time who was in grad school with me. And she said, "Oh, you've got to come. I've been going to this coffee shop with these people and they're great." And I was like, I cannot go to a church plant where there are 10 other people. It's going to feel like an awkward date or worse, and I had church hopped around and had really not found a place. And, I showed up and then I didn't leave, believe it or not.
So I'm really glad.
Me
about
too.
that. I'm really glad that you showed up and didn't leave and that you're still here and we're having this conversation today for so many reasons. But so as you graduated from grad school and then began your work in Denver, at the same time as an adult, you were being formed spiritually as you were finding sort of in your interactions, your day-to-day interactions via work with many people, with many communities in the city who are poorer, are marginalized. How did the one impact the other? So how did your work in those communities impact your faith? And then also, what about your faith catalyzes your work?
That is such the $1 million question, and also the one that we should be asking, honestly, and the one that I have to remember to ask myself a lot to keep myself rooted in the things that are most important as a Christian and a person in politics. And if you need anything in politics, you need some roots. Mm-hmm. So I would say that some of my first experiences in Denver working with women in refugee communities, it's sort of like my job was to present workshops to help them get mammograms, for example. And, can you imagine going to a Thai temple and giving a bunch of women an example of what a mammogram is and why it matters without having someone who speaks their language with you? Sort of like this was a program run by the state health department overall, and then it was kind of contracted to the agency I worked with. And it was kind of like, how can people have access to important health services if they don't speak the language? Mm-hmm. And why would they want to listen to me? And there are all sorts of like research and data reports that would show these specific populations were more at risk of developing this kind of cancer, and this is why this program is funded from the state level. However, if you're not doing it in a culturally relevant way, in a place where these women feel comfortable, they're not going to come and get the really important information.
Mm-hmm. And so they may not even know that the program exists for them.
Well, why would they unless you do outreach and go places where you don't live? So it's kind of like stretching yourself outside your comfort zone is so much more than just taking a walk in a neighborhood that doesn't feel safe, because safe is not a thing. It's like different, what is different? What is different than the way you grew up, and starting to really use that perspective as a Christian and a Christ follower to really emphasize the dignity and the fact that everyone is an image bearer of God. So they have inherent dignity. And so traveling around Denver, speaking to people about their bodies is a really very human part of recognizing their dignity and the fact, like I said, that they're image bearers and that it matters. Like their health matters, their quality of life matters. It matters to someone like me who is white and from a totally different community and upbringing. And really going to where they live is important, because it's always so easy to say, this service is available. No, it's really available. But if it's not available in a language or in a community or a neighborhood where people who need it live, then it's not reaching or meeting the needs. And so not only is good policy designed that way, I think a lot of the social work and programs that our state or our communities run, really, when it's effective, it does that. So I think that my faith and my lens on what social work is and what helping people really is has been impacted by those kinds of driving around Broomfield and looking for the Thai temple and thinking I've never been here before. Or another job that I had is at an organization called the Blue Bench, and they are Denver's sexual assault prevention organization, the main one anyway. And what my job was to walk in and out of high schools and to teach women and girls about self-defense and to help run a crisis hotline. So again, meeting immediate needs, but also working on the education and community outreach side as far as letting people know this exists and you matter. Really did always continue to bring home in some of the toughest circumstances and, most complicated sorts of conversations you can have. As a Christian, I believe that this person's experience matters to God and that their bodies and their hearts and their minds matter to God, regardless of how they've been treated or what they feel in that moment. And so offering those critical services in the moment is important, but also, like I said, policy development and trying to address these things that are part of bigger systems is also a really important role for Christians who believe that human flourishing and justice are such an important part of our work in whatever way, we've been called to impact the world.
And you mentioned, too, the need to remain rooted. You've been doing this sort of work, advocacy work, in different ways, in different organizations over the past many years. How have you, as a follower of Jesus, sought that out? What have you done to remain rooted and to not be pulled in opposing directions by the work that you do and the interactions that you have?
It's also a really good question. I think it's a learning process I'll be in until I'm gone. I mean, it is such a opportunity for growth and connection. But I think that as a Christian, observing things like that make up a life, spiritual disciplines and the spiritual formation of committing to a community, committing to knowing what God says about his people and about the earth. And so the practices that keep you rooted are praying, which has always been one of the biggest struggles for me because I see so many things wrong with the world, and prayer requires faith, and prayer requires hope, and prayer requires this relationship. And so developing that, the only way I know how to stay rooted is to remember that I am not in charge. And that is both freeing and scary when you're facing all sorts of these situations where people are outside, people are marginalized, people need justice, people are hurting. So some of the ways that I have remained rooted, again, we mentioned I've been at Fellowship this entire time and have been lucky enough to watch it grow and change and know some people for so long and understand the ups and downs of that. That is all part of spiritual formation and spiritual growth as a Christian. And I think through my work, understanding that I am not in charge, like I said, is the key for me to not float away completely. I think I'm an empath, and being an empath in politics and policy is so tricky. I sometimes cannot believe I've ended up here. It is not the job for someone who has a bleeding heart. And yet I think God has continually reminded me that I need to be rooted in what is true. And even when I see things that are just like unfathomable, which I think I see on a weekly basis, like the injustices in this society, God reminds me that my role is small. And I think that is a huge relief to know that at some point things will be made right and they are not right now, and to sit in that and then to do the small role that I can do. And I really gain a lot of personal satisfaction and purpose from like just interacting with people that God has made, people who are different than me, people who don't believe the same things I believe, and being a representation of like hope and peace and love, which is so lacking. I think everyone agrees with that, but when you really get in the grittiness, that's like where the good stuff is. And if I weren't in this role in policy, I probably wouldn't be as forced to go back to what I believe over and over and over again. And I think I wouldn't have survived this long without it. And I also have had like lots of, mental health help and lots of support and lots of prayer. And like, there's lots of ways that we can get help. But I think the rootedness in like what is true is really key for me to not totally float away, like, which seems nice some days to honestly just float away and not think about it. But I always come back to,
I think
like,
that's
this
called
is important.
a coping strategy.
Yes.
When you want to just float away
Yes.
and not think about it. When I envision being a bird, I think that's a coping strategy.
I know.
But connection to God
Yes.
through his word and prayer, connection to God's people, to community, and that can be within the church and then probably other friends you have as well.
Yes. Knowing that there are other people who are engaged in this work and fighting for justice or dignity, or trying to make the quality of life for kids, trying to protect them, trying to be their advocate when they can't speak for themselves. Like knowing that that is a value that other Christians hold is just feeling like you're not alone. And I think understanding, yes, again, I keep saying this, but I really am trying to lecture myself into believing it, that my role is actually quite small, and that is a relief, because for me to believe in God, I have to believe that there are things I just don't understand, and I won't right now. And I think for me that's something that I think is harder for other people to accept than me. But I think seeing so many things that are just unbelievable or like unfair over and over again, you do sort of have to go to a specific place with that. And that's kind of how I've
and
coped.
the place to which you go, the place that you found hope, is what you said, is that realizing that you have a future hope, a now hope, and a future hope, and also recognizing that your prioritization of God, your understanding of justice as being ultimately handled by God, allows you to remain present in the work that you do. But that isn't the case for everyone. I'm sure that's not the case for many of your coworkers.
Right.
That their hope really is in this process, and that they see the way to enact justice as being through this political process.
Right.
So in that way, you're working with people who have a markedly different perspective, even if you agree on some of the particulars of what you're working on.
Right.
You have a different, bigger perspective, a different worldview. And then also in these community situations that you described, you're interacting with, as you've mentioned many times, people who are very different. And you probably are faced with a lot of different opinions. One thing that we haven't called out specifically, but that I know is true of your work, is that you travel to a lot of places around the state to actually be in person. Maybe not as much now, maybe not as much in COVID, but traditionally what this role looks like is that you travel to those places to sit with people literally around a table and listen to them. And your work many times takes you to rural areas, which traditionally have different values and are culturally shaped differently than what we might encounter here in the metro area. And so you are present in a lot of different ways with your coworkers, with the people who you're working with as community advocates, and listening a lot to a lot of different perspectives. So how do you formulate opinions, beliefs that you hold to, you find rootedness in God, but then also you're actively working on these issues, and you have to help advance a certain certain perspective, a certain agenda. So how do you sit and listen open-mindedly and with an open heart and hand, not holding so tightly to what you think, and invite in different perspectives? How do you go about doing that?
Well, it's very simple. No,
it
isn't.
Yeah. We've been waiting for this. Katie has the answer.
I do. I don't know if you take anything away from this podcast, that is it. Autumn, I actually think you could do my job. That was an excellent summary, and do it well. But I would say what is missing so much in politics and in Christians in so many formats where we live and work, the humility lens and the lens of understanding that it is not about us. Like, if I tell myself anything, it's like over and over, it is not about you. It is not about you. And I fail at that constantly. But I think effective policy, effective community engagement is going to where people actually are and making yourself uncomfortable on behalf of a greater good, a greater cause. That is just something that as a human, we don't always want to do. It costs us. And I have gained so much and grown so much in my travels. So you're right. This time of year, I would normally be on a sort of tour around Colorado. It's one of my favorite parts of my job. Our state is so incredible, not just the parts people visit, but the entire thing is made up of so much diverse perspective, backgrounds, agriculture, cities, educational perspectives. It's really an amazing state. Topography. No, okay, I'm done. But it really is. And if I've learned anything, I came here for grad school. I was going to leave. I stayed. It's so basic of me. But I've genuinely fallen in love with this state. And it is not because of the mountains. It is because of learning and knowing the communities that make it up. And I feel really lucky to be able to go to places like Ouray and Cortez and Trinidad and Lamar and Yuma and Lyman, which I thought was Limon for a little while, and Alamosa, and all of these parts. Oh gosh, I could keep going. So the point of my trips are to bring data to these communities about how kids and families are doing, get context for, is this right? Is this not right? Why are there so many, fill in the blanks in your community and not in others? And we really learn a lot from these data trends. And then I also sit there, like you said, at their tables and in their community rec centers and wherever they host these luncheons. I have been in every setting, like literally every setting. And hear, how are they doing? And it is not effective if you can't do that. So what I have learned is that if you really want to know how people are doing, you have to ask them and ask them again, and you have to go to where they live. You have to, it is literally what Jesus did. He put feet and a human body on and came to us. And I understand that I'm not necessarily doing Jesus's work, but I do think that it is part of the greater Christian mandate for what God asks us to do in the world is to go to people and, value what they say, whether or not I agree with it. So you're right, Autumn. There could be a specific policy I'm working on, such as, let's see, I can think of so many. So we work in health, K-12 education, early childhood, and then a lot of family economic security, issues like housing, safe schools, all sorts of things. So going from, as you can imagine, different communities, there are a variety of views around when should kids have access to this or that, or when should families have any paid leave? Should they not? How are we going to make this happen? And so my organization has a view on some of these. We support paid family leave. We also understand how complicated something like that would be to enforce and really make feasible for every community, including farmers and small businesses and big corporations. And so my job is to really hear from people and try to put that together. And like
make
I
sure
said,
they're being represented well.
Yes, make sure they're being represented. And I think that humility piece that is lacking is, again, it is not about me, and understanding that whether or not this turns out, I have still been able to hear their perspective and value their family, their circumstances. And I think, like you mentioned, the people I work with who are just, again, the most talented people ever, this is only one lever that I use. I do believe that there's more at stake and more at work than just me in the world. And I think when you put all your faith in any one solution, it's going to disappoint you. And policy, as we all know, and politics can be very disappointing. And people fail you. And I think understanding from a bigger perspective, how Jesus wants us to be in the world really does give value to these very small, very, it's such a small part of what I do, having a meal with someone, but it's such a big thing.
I see in the politics class, we've discussed that the role of government is to build a platform for peace, order, and flourishing in a fallen world. And the way that occurs is that government is supposed to hold back or work against forces of evil, forces of violence and evil that would upset this sense of peace and order and flourishing. And then it also is supposed to promote a sort of good. So prevent evil, promote good. And the way as Christians that we uniquely see that happening is through the protection and opportunity for the Imago Dei, the image of God in every person to flourish. So when you talk about your work, and as I listen to you describe what it is that you're doing, what your organization attempts to do, and how it is that you show up in these places to listen to people, I see your work as a part of attempting to do that, to the part that promotes the flourishing of people, the thriving of people, the opportunity of each person who bears the image of God to participate in the systems around us, to have an opportunity to participate in those systems, to have access to those systems. And so you're seeking to identify, where is that happening? Where is that not happening? Right. And then to call attention to those issues. And I love what you said about the incarnation, about how it was that Jesus came to be present with people, and that in a way, in your work, when you show up with people in that way, you can represent that to someone. When I think about sitting in a discussion and hearing a lot of different opinions and being able to listen, remain rooted in what we know is our ultimate hope, remain rooted in our identity in Christ, and still listen, the thing that makes me able to do that, I'm flattered that you said I could do your job. I don't know that that's true. I think you do your job very well. But when I am in that situation, the thing that makes me able to do it is to look at that person, to realize that they have a face and a heart and are able to be hurt, that they experience pain, that they too are attempting to navigate life, and that in all of these ways, they bear the image of God that is imprinted on each one of us. And so in all of these ways, we have this common humanity. And what we allow to divide us has to play that down in order for us to highlight what it is that divides us. So showing up in that way, just being present with someone, listening, looking at them, and allowing them to do the same to you is what Jesus did. Right. He came to be present in that way, in embodied form with us. And then we, as his representatives, can do that. Right. We obviously are not Jesus, but we can show up and be present and recognize the humanity in each person and every person that we're listening to, whether we agree with them ultimately or not. Lastly, what I'm hoping to talk about with you today, Katie, is this idea of justice. It is tough in these political conversations to pin down some of these terms that we use often. One thing that we discussed a couple of weeks ago on the podcast was the term flourishing. When we use these terms, sometimes we're sharing a term and meaning different things when we use that term. And often we in the church use it with something in mind that is tied to a biblical truth. And then we use it in a secular setting, and the understanding might be different. So when we talk about justice, I want to make clear that it is based in a biblical understanding of justice. In the Bible, throughout the Bible collectively, we see God executing a sort of punishment or retributive justice against evil. And sometimes that affected his people when they refused to listen to him. And in many ways, we see God working on behalf of humans and his creation in a restorative way, that there is God's restorative justice was woven into the law that he gave Israel. It obviously was addressed in the prophets. It, again, was present in Jesus' life and teaching. We see restorative justice in the way he was righting sickness and illness and wrongs done against people, and ways in which people were oppressed and marginalized. And then in the epistles, there were ideas about God's restorative justice that the church, the early church, was seeking to live out. For instance, in the way that they cared for widows. It was one specific issue that comes up in Acts and then in a couple of the epistles following that, as the early church was trying to figure out how to put Jesus' teachings into practice. The way in which God's justice takes shape in the Bible is really 4 significant ways. It's in generosity. So again, we see this in the early church. We see both commands given to the church and then ways in which they existed together that display that sort of generosity. It was present in the Old Testament in, for instance, the gleaning laws that God wove into the ways in which Israel existed together, so that the poor were cared for. There's equality is another way in which God's restorative justice takes shape throughout the Bible. And that is very present in Jesus' ministry teaching. And then again, in the early church, what was really radical about it was that divisions that had previously separated people societally were specifically called out as not present or not supposing to separate people in the church, that they shouldn't allow issues of gender or socioeconomic status or race or differing backgrounds to separate them. There was a real call to unity, and the basis of that was the equality that they had because of the gospel, because of Jesus' work on their behalf in Christ. We see it take shape in advocacy on behalf of people who are oppressed. And interestingly, most of the Bible was written directly to people who were experiencing oppression, direct oppression. Sometimes this is hard for us from our particular vantage point in history, where we sit as having lived in a society that has experienced freedom and wealth, to actually put ourselves in that place to imagine that. But most of the Bible was written to people who were experiencing direct oppression or direct hardship. And then we see God's justice take place in corporate and personal responsibility, in a call to that. Sounds like a lot. There are theologians and scholars who have written about the ways in which God's justice takes shape in the world. The difficulty that we sit in as followers of Jesus and as people who want to carry out these models, to participate with God in these models of biblical justice that he's given us, is that we know that no one is just without being justified. This gives us a very different viewpoint on justice than what we might typically see debated in the public square, in the electoral and governmental and persuasive politics, in which justice is based on our understanding of civil rights. So justice, in our understanding as followers of Jesus, is that God is just, that it flows from his character, that we see the ways it takes shape in the world. And then if we are followers of Jesus, we are justified, and not because of our action, but because of something that was done on our behalf. We then are called to live justly as God's followers who have received this righteousness. We are to be God's representatives who model this sort of biblical justice to the world. So these matters, generosity, equality, advocacy, and responsibility, living in this way and promoting corporate and personal responsibility, are incumbent upon us as God's representatives.
Right. There's not a lot of wiggle room. I mean, and that's kind of how I have felt increasingly as I have looked around the world and seen the massive needs and injustices. And I think at this point, you have to be closing your eyes and ears to not know. And like you mentioned, living a life as I have, one of privilege, being middle class and white and cared for, and I had anything that I needed and I have not lacked, has meant that I have grown up in a very specific way that a lot of people have not. And no matter their background or experience, like you said, it is incumbent on us as followers of Christ to address these things in the ways that we can. knowing that ultimately God will set things right. But I keep thinking of Isaiah 58 because that is one of the first, I think, when I was kind of coming into like, how do I get involved in social work? Like, what does it mean to actually like set some of these things right, and being so overwhelmed. And I just like, what is true fasting? Like, what does that mean? I spoke earlier of spiritual practices and spiritual formation, and it's like God was talking so many thousands of years ago to people, and it's like, what do I really mean when I say, like, when you observe like this time that is set apart for me and how I want to transform you as my people, like, what does it actually mean? Like, no, it means like heart change, and it means action. Like, it means so many different things, but building bridges and restoring dwellings and like being someone who takes off the yoke of oppression or is involved in that is not something that we as Christ followers can avoid. Like, that's not something that we get away with not addressing. And I think God uses so many different, there's so many ways to do this work, and living an ordinary life and being a good spouse, being a good, like being a faithful, like daughter, son, family member, parent, like employee, person in the world, like that is hugely important. Living an ordinary life and having your circle of influence like be under this sort of guidance is huge. But there are also other ways that we can get involved. And like I said, as a social worker being in policy, sometimes I'm like, how did I end up here? And other times I think I get to impact on a large level how many kids get to go to kindergarten this year. And that matters. Like, that matters because it matters to those families and it matters to those kids. And every kid and every parent should matter. Every individual should matter, no matter what I think about them. And it's sort of a way of enacting justice in the way that we can. And I think, like you said, it's generosity with time, generosity and impacting like people's lives in the way that we can as Christians is just, it's what we're here for, really.
Yeah, I want to make it clear too that as a church, what we're called to is unity in Christ.
Right.
So we understand that these matters that are inherent to the way God is bringing about justice in the world, that are incumbent on us, that when it comes to a matter of political processes and policy and electoral politics, that we do have space to disagree about the best way in which those things can be done. However, we as followers of Jesus do not have an opt-out to participating in those issues. So we can still disagree about then the political process that takes shape, the particular policies, whether or not they are enacting this sort of justice for these groups of people. All of that is still covered under this big umbrella of unity in the gospel.
Right.
And allowing Jesus to retain that priority over our political affiliation. It also sounds really big to say all those categories one after the other.
Yep.
So you gave us some great examples of generosity. Generosity with time, listening well is a way in which you can be generous with yourself and your presence, is a small way in which you can love someone and enact this sort of justice that we see God describing for us. There are many, many ways. And even though it sounds really big, it is summarized. These ideas, these big themes of justice are summarized for us over and over in the Bible when God says to love God, first of all, and then to love our neighbor as ourself. And I think that ties back to, Katie, what you were saying about allowing ourselves to be, to experience discomfort on behalf of someone else. It is a love that promotes us to take action. So it is not simply being kind. No, that is good. That is a good first step. But it is a love that prompts us to act on someone else's behalf.
Yes, I have, and not to just step in there, but I just remembered how many times I've said to myself, like, when you see this, you have to respond. I mean, I have just felt so compelled. Like if I had known when I was 18 what I would be doing at 40, I don't know if I would have counseled myself this direction, because it's been a path of like heartache and a lot of sorrow and a lot of, like I said, I've used the word like grittiness and just things that like don't seem, holding the dissonance of holding like these both and situations. Like I may not agree with this, but here we are. And then trying to weave in like, what does God want me to do? And again, for an empath, like I could spend up all night just like, rending garments and mourning and grieving. And I'm very good at sitting in like the suffering of it, but that is not the only thing that we're supposed to do. Like we like have an opportunity to take action, and the Midwestern pragmatist that I am, like I want to do something. Like I can only sit and wallow for so long. And I think we all have a role, and there are just so many ways, like donating time, donating money, praying, actually like extending like forgiveness, understanding how justice works, and that we won't see it maybe on this side, but we work towards it regardless is really what we're called to do. And taking those action steps the way that I'm doing it right now is through creating equitable policy and engaging the community around what they need and how we can better serve, especially kids and families who are marginalized and furthest away from like having access to things they need to thrive. But there are so many other ways. And I think whatever way you are called, it's like an act of obedience to do it, no matter how uncomfortable it can make us. And again, that is a learning process that I anticipate being on forever. Some days are easier than others, but I'm really grateful to be engaged in something that I think has such eternal value, no matter what it looks like and how, like I said, gritty. Some days are really unglamorous when you sit in rooms where you're not going to be able to fix it. And that is just kind of like part of my responsibility, knowing that this world is not my home. Honestly, it's not.
We, in kids ministry, I lead kids ministry here at Fellowship. In kids ministry, we are putting together these packets every month. In our monthly packet, we include a small card that has a love your neighbor prompt.
It's my favorite part of the packet, for the record.
Katie has kids.
Yeah.
So they
even if I didn't, I would like the packet.
They are recipients of these packets. But we just put in a love your neighbor prompt, and they're really simple things, and they're so convicting for me as an adult. We intentionally make them things that kids or their parents can do together. But the point is to refocus, not on yourself.
Yes.
The point of those little prompts is to start to put into practice actively looking around you, noticing what is impacting others, and then showing up there. And that is something that we can all do every day in a simple interaction with someone you've met for the first time, or in your family system, in your neighborhood. That just looking around, noticing what is impacting people. And if you don't know, starting to ask, find out what's impacting people, and then showing up there to be present, to listen if you can, help. And so we have talked about a lot of big ideas, but on the ground, day to day, there's simple ways that we can start to put this into practice. Katie, thanks so much for taking time to share with us today about your work to help us understand these systems too. I know that so much of this has been a good refresher for me about all these processes that exist that I really may or may not understand very well. So thanks for sharing that with us, and then just also sharing some of your heart with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. This podcast is based on your questions and suggestions. To submit a question, you can send it in via email to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org or via text by texting podcast to 94000. Thanks to our guest, Hunter Beaumont, to Adam Englund for our theme music, and to our producer, Jesse Cowan.